The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
I'd like to welcome you back to, as promised, Part 2 with Republican nominee for United States Senate, Dave McCormick. First, however, a correction must be noted from the previous show. In a reference I had made to the radical progressive Democratic governor of Minnesota, and now Kamala Harris's running mate for Vice President of the United States, Tim Walz, I had said on my show last week that he had put, mistakenly I said condoms in the boys' bathrooms of public schools in Minnesota. That was incorrect. What I should have said was tampons. Vice presidential nominee Tim Walz, the Democratic governor of Minnesota, had tampons placed in boys' bathrooms in the public schools of Minnesota. I wanted to make sure I got that correct. I'd also like to point out, since the subject has now been raised, of how radically left Tim Walz is, I read recently an insightful editorial by the Washington Examiner's Nicole Russell. She talks about Walz's chameleon-like persona, presenting one version to get elected, then morphing back to his true self and becoming governor of Minnesota. She says the folksy Walz seems like the neighbor you'd like to have a beer or go hunting with, which of course is true in what we've seen from the media so far. However, as governor, he became a progressive darling, trying to make Minnesota a magnet and a mecca of progressivism. When Walz was trotted out as Harris's running mate, former Republican governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty, quipped that Walz was, quote, Bernie Sanders in hunting gear. Like Sanders, Walz embraces socialism, taxing Minnesotans at an exorbitant tax rate, nearly 10% for the highest earners. This created an $18 billion surplus. But instead of lowering taxes, Walz created one of the most radical progressive agendas in America. Walz promoted and signed into law in Minnesota a bill that allows abortion right up to birth. In 2023, Walz signed a trans refuge bill, making Minnesota a sanctuary state for minors who seek sex changes, creating protections for minors against their own parents for gender transition care. The law allows Minnesota courts to use the issue of transgender medical care to determine child custody, and gives courts jurisdiction if a minor child comes to Minnesota wanting transgender-related care or a sex change where the state they come from doesn't allow it. It's open, fair game in Minnesota. Walz supports open borders, as well as the soft on crime policies that Kamala Harris embodied when she was the district attorney of San Francisco and a U.S. senator from California. During COVID-19, believe it or not, Walz was more extreme than our own dictatorial governor, Tom Wolf, ruling Minnesota by executive fiat. During the George Floyd summer of 2020, Minneapolis-St. Paul, the Twin Cities, became a flashpoint for riots, resulting in the destruction of 1,500 buildings, costing taxpayers $500 million to repair. As a result of Walz's radical policies, Minnesota became one of the top states in the country with the mass exodus of its citizens in 2023. It has become very clear what a Kamala Harris-Tim Walz administration would look like. Instead of picking a moderate, like Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Kamala Harris chose someone even more radically left than she is. I can't imagine a future with that administration. Having said all that now, we will segue back to our own Republican nominee here in Pennsylvania's candidacy for United States Senate, Dave McCormick.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
I am a huge supporter of IBF. And this is, Chuck, I don't know how much you know about this, but when I was a CEO of Bridgewater, this was a benefit that I gave to every employee, men and women.
Define IBF, Dave. for our
IVF.
audience.
IVF is a fertility treatment. Fertility treatment to help women have children, and often if women stay in the workforce, it gets harder the older they get, and it's very expensive. People who aren't making significant income can't necessarily afford it. It could be anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 per treatment, and it doesn't always work. So this is a huge part of reproductive rights. And so as a CEO, I gave this benefit to all our employees. I get some of the most unbelievable thank you notes, like thank you for allowing us to have the joy of parenthood. I've proposed about 6 weeks ago, President Trump came out with something related to this last week. I proposed an IVF tax credit. So $15,000 tax credit. If you're going to pay $15,000, you can take to tax the tax man. You could take that $15,000 and use it for fertility treatment up to 2 times in a row, because it doesn't always work. And this allows the joy of parenthood to be more available for everybody, no matter how much money you make. You know, it's kind of like school choice. Rich people get school choice. They can send their kids wherever they want.
All the top Democrats send their kids to private schools. Josh Shapiro, our governor, sends his children to private school.
Bob Casey, Scranton Prep, right? Yeah. So listen, we gotta make the joy of parenthood. It's not, not everybody has to have kids. I'm not saying that, but anyone who wants to have children, we should make it economically within reach. And this is a problem at the national level, Chuck. We need to have 2.1 kids per family to keep our population at the same size. Right now, our population's shrinking because our replacement rate's only 1.8. So we need to help people have children, experience the joy of parenthood, and an IVF tax credit is way to do it. That's not traditional Republican thinking necessarily.
Dave, we have to talk a little bit also about, you're going to be very involved, in your experience lends itself to foreign affairs. And we now are engaged in effectively 2 Cold Wars, I call them. One relative to Russian invasion in Ukraine, and the other one relative to supporting our, if there's an ally other than Great Britain and the United Kingdom that has been closer to America for the last 75 years, it's Israel. Yeah. Talk about those 2 conflicts. Your military experience speaks volumes of your expertise, please.
Yeah, listen, I'm heartbroken by the death of the hostages that we learned about over the weekend. And let me start with Iran, because my wife and I, Dina, went to Israel early in the new year. We saw firsthand the brutality that happened on October 7th. We went to a village called Kfar Aza. We had 800 people, Chuck, 100 of them butchered. I'm talking beheadings, people burned, parents killed in front of the kids. You can't believe the degree of evil. It's like a horror movie, except it's real.
They cut babies out of pregnant mothers' wombs and filmed it.
It's unbelievable, Chuck. And you can't come away from that without thinking Hamas is pure evil. We have to support Israel in eradicating Hamas, and it's the toughest fighting you can ever do. From my military days, that urban warfare, you're fighting in Gaza, this urban warfare, block to block, building to building, room to room. But there's a whole other city underneath that we help pay for. Billions of dollars of tunnels and reinforcement. But it's not just Hamas. And it's not just against Israel, and it's not just anti-Semitism. It's anti-Americanism. And Israel, the original sin was Iran. Obama did the deal with Iran. The deciding vote was Senator Casey. Gave them $100 billion of sanctioned money in 2015, Chuck. And that money has been used to underwrite terrorist groups across the Middle East. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas. So we got to go after Iran. And the way to go after Iran is to strangle them. We got to reimpose the sanctions. Biden, Harris, and Casey have been incredibly weak on this. Right now, Iran is exporting $60 billion of oil to China. That's their primary source of income. And China's our other adversary, as you know, Chuck. So this is about being tough and reaffirming our deterrence. Iran's on the verge of a nuclear weapon. All of this is the result of the weakness of Biden and Harris. And I want to spend a second on the anti-Semitism here at home. That's connected. You go and see these protests on these campuses, these encampments. I went to Penn. I saw it firsthand. From the river to the sea, go back to Poland. The terrorism of Jewish students. A kid who supports me wore a McCormick t-shirt, University of Pittsburgh, got dragged down by someone across the barricades. This is unacceptable, and it's also anti-Americanism. And it all comes down to a lack of moral clarity and a lack of leadership on part of college presidents and on the part of our public officials. And this is where Senator Casey's been weak. I called out for the firing of Liz McGill. Bob Casey doesn't do that. I say we can't support Summer Lee. She's the biggest anti-Semite in the Congress. She's my congresswoman in Pittsburgh. Bob Casey endorses her. Bob Casey has been weak every step of the way. We need to stand with Israel. So it's all about leadership. It's all about moral clarity. It's all about strength. Senator Casey's demonstrated none of those.
Let me interject on this point first. I say this, I speak from the heart. I don't know how any Jewish American can vote Democratic. I don't know how any one of them, can somehow rationalize that their liberal views justify supporting a party that is clearly anti-Israel. I made a point in a view, Dave. I like your comment. I don't remember in World War II, we were engaged in a fight against tyranny and evil, just like Hamas. And when the greatest generation stormed the beaches at Normandy and it was being slaughtered to get a beachhead started, and they progressed across the European continent, I don't remember anybody calling for a ceasefire in America because, God forbid, there were civilian casualties. That's what war is. It's awful. But the reason we have hostages and casualties are because of Hamas. And you cannot crater and cater to and countenance that is weakness. And if you appease tyranny and evil, it destroys you. I don't get it.
I couldn't agree more. And listen, you can't negotiate with people that live 600 meters away from you and want to slit your throat in the middle of the night. That's what Hamas is. That's what Hamas is. I agree with you. And listen, as you know, I'm a military guy. I've served in an elite unit. When I was in Israel with my wife, we went and visited the IDF. We went to some of the drone units and watched them do their targeting. There's an enormous amount of care being taken. I watched those images of civilians, men and women, or women and children, particularly in Gaza, being injured or killed. I'm heartbroken. It is awful to see. But you're right. The core source of what's going on is Hamas. They've not released the hostages, and Israel and the IDF, from what I can see, are taking every step to try to minimize civilian casualties. They're announcing in advance where they're going to attack. They're creating the humanitarian corridors. They're trying to get food and water in. But Hamas has embedded themselves in the civilian population in hospitals and schools, which make it so tragically difficult. And that next great generation, you talk about World War II. That the 82nd was one of the great units that jumped into Normandy on that day. My unit that I served in. I want to tell you, Chuck, one of my great worries, and it gets to your macro question about foreign affairs, is we don't have people who want to go into our military anymore. All the services missed their recruiting numbers last year, except the Marine Corps. The Army missed it, Air Force and Navy missed it. And only about 9% of Americans have any interest in serving. And a small fraction of them actually qualify to serve. And this is a problem. And it's a result of a lot of things. It's a result of a growing...
DEI comes to mind. In our generals, they're promoting generals that are qualified to conduct DER sensitivity training seminars, Dave. I thought you learned how to, God forbid, have to kill the enemy.
You got it, man. You got it. And here's the problem. And this is why you need a senator from Pennsylvania in the Senate that actually has some experience with these things. I think the next 10 years will be probably the most risky 10 years in the last 100 years, post-World War II, certainly, in terms of our adversaries testing us. You have China testing us, rattling its saber on Taiwan. You have Putin on the march against Ukraine. You have Iran supporting terrorist groups across the Middle East, anti-Americanism on the march. You have North Korea, who certainly has nuclear capability. Those combination of adversaries, and they all think the following thing. They think under Biden-Harris, and Casey's been with him every step of the way, we are weak. And you and I learned this lesson. We learned it on the playground. If the bully thinks you're weak, they're going to push you. They're going to punch you in the nose. And the only way you reestablish deterrence is you be tough. You have ability and will to punch them back. And they know if they punch you in the nose, they're going to get punched 10 times harder. We've lost that under Biden and Harris. And Casey has been weak on all these issues. And so, listen, when I'm on the campaign trail, people are worried about their pocketbook and making ends meet because of sky-high inflation. They're worried that their nephew or son or daughter just died of fentanyl. They're worried that our natural gas industry is shrinking. They're worried about crime in the cities. That's what this election's mostly about. But I want to warn your listeners and your viewers that we're going into some choppy water here. And we need people at the helm that know how to be strong against the adversaries that'll test us around the world. And I don't think there's any reason to believe Bob Casey has shown that strength.
Well, you know, as a point in case of what you're talking about, we almost can't talk about weakness without talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan to start his presidency.
Yeah.
Biden and Harris.
It makes me want to throw up every time I think about it. Honestly, that was, I might have mentioned this to you. That was sort of the final straw that got me to run last time. I ran in 22, as you know, for the Senate primary. I lost a very close race by 900 votes, but it was that final straw that's made me think, God, I got to do it. And we just had the 3-year anniversary. As you know, 13 service members, are Afghanis dropping out of the wheel wells of U.S. Air Force aircraft, hundreds of Americans left behind, a Bagram Air Force base taken over by the Afghanis and eventually the Chinese. This was an epic disaster. Not a single person, Chuck, has been fired. Not a single person has been fired based on the debacle that was Afghanistan. And it sent a message to China, to Russia, to Iran, to bad guys around the world. Listen, America's incompetent. America's weak.
I'd like to ask the veterans, about what they think about subsidizing illegal immigrants in our country when they're homeless. They're living in homeless encampments. I can't wrap my head around a lot of what the far left progressive Democratic leadership is doing to the country. So
I agree with you. And that veterans problem is feeding that recruitment problem.
Of course it is. Of course
I'll end on this point, Chuck. This bracelet here is from an organization called Mission 22. 22 vets a day kill themselves today. 20 years into these wars overseas, 22 vets a day kill themselves. We still haven't gotten a handle on that. It's tragic. I hear it all over the place. Pennsylvania is a huge veteran state, as you know. If I'm fortunate enough to be in the Senate, I'm going to be it says a lot about a country in terms of how they treat those who have put their life on the line for them. I'll be a senator that our vets can count on to fight for them every day because I'm one of them, and I know what they've sacrificed.
Well, as our time grows short on our second episode, one other gaping disaster across this entire country we haven't gotten to yet, the catastrophe of crime. If you look at progressive Democratic-run cities, Dave, across this country, Los Angeles looks like post-apocalyptic movies right now. Los Angeles is a demilitarized zone. All of Chicago, pick one. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with the miscreant DA Larry Krasner, who I've done 3 different views about. The former African-American Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia, issued a scathing rebuke, like saying, don't tell us that you progressive Democrats are for people of color, because you're not. And so talk a little bit about crime, and then we'll let you go with that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, listen, I was really honored to get the endorsement of the FOP. 44,000 men and women in blue across our great Commonwealth. That was an endorsement Senator Casey has gotten in the past. And the reason they gave that endorsement to me is I know what it's like to wear a uniform. It's a different uniform, but we've got to stand behind the men and women in blue to make sure they have the adequate resources to be able to protect us. Our communities, particularly our urban communities, are falling apart. As you said, Philadelphia is a great example. Larry Krasner put in place an incredibly ridiculous set of policies. If you steal less than $1,000, you're not prosecuted, just as an example, right? But that's killing our urban centers. It's killing our minority communities. I've met with African-American small business owners in Philadelphia. They can't keep open their businesses because of crime, shoplifting. It is making it difficult to have safe families. We've got to turn that around. The way to do it is to have prosecutors that are law and order prosecutors, is to support our men and women in blue with adequate funding, is to give them qualified immunity. My home in Pittsburgh, there were 1,000 officers in the Pittsburgh police force in 2020. There's 650 now. In my neighborhood in Squirrel Hill, we have about half the patrols we used to have 4 years ago. You cannot have safety, you cannot have community, you cannot have a business without bringing law and order. It's a mindset. It's support for the people that bring law. It's recognizing that law enforcement is critical to our health and well-being. And as a senator from Pennsylvania, I'm gonna take that one on as a key priority. And I can tell wherever I go, parades, urban areas, I think the people that are wearing uniform know it. They know that they can count on it.
And we'll end with a comment from me about the Democratic mayor of Pittsburgh and the Democratic congresswoman you referenced, Summer Lee, don't support the police. That's why. Like progressive Democratic prosecutors all over this great country of ours don't support their police, and that's why you have the dropping numbers. Well, at any rate, Dave, I know you have a busy campaign schedule. I appreciate the extra time, and we needed to tell people what's at stake in this election, and you were the perfect person to do that on this show. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for having me. It's always an honor to be on your show. I appreciate it and hope to see you in person soon.
Absolutely, Dave. Having already discussed the far-left socialist radicalism of Kamala Harris's running mate, one Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, it would be appropriate to compare and contrast him with the current vice president and Democratic nominee for president, Harris. Amazingly, there's nothing to contrast because they're the same progressive socialists cut from the same cloth. All you have to do to see how radicalized the National Democratic Party has become is to only look back to 2020. Back then, the Democrats were in a panic because after the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries, if you remember, the leading contenders for the Democratic nomination for president were Senator Bernie Sanders, socialist, Senator Elizabeth Warren, socialist, and Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, closet socialist. The horror. The Democratic brain trusts were in a shambles. This country would never elect a socialist as president. The last time such a far-left nominee was put up by the Democrats, 1972's George McGovern, who was a mere liberal, not a socialist, they lost 49 out of 50 states to Richard Nixon. Therefore, something drastic had to be done, and it was. The powers that be got behind Joe Biden, who had just finished 5th in the New Hampshire primary, in single digits, and was getting ready to drop out of the race. And then the Democrats pulled off a magic trick. With the help of former President Barack Obama and Congressman Clyburn of South Carolina, they helped Biden win South Carolina big, and the momentum carried him on to the Democratic nomination. This miracle was akin to Jesus raising Lazarus from the grave. Then they did the right thing. They kept Joe Biden mostly locked in his basement for the entire fall campaign in 2020, because they remembered, even when Biden was younger and at the top of his game, for example, in his presidential runs in 1988 and 2008, his foot and mouth disease ended those campaigns. And then, of course, there was the plagiarism issue. The reason they chose Biden was he was the only credible moderate candidate in the race. And remember, that's where 80% of voters, Republican and Democrat, are. Biden was their only option, and the magic trick worked. He won. Now, 4 years later, the National Democratic Party picked 2 far-left socialists to represent their party. Remember, they had a chance to balance their ticket, to pick a moderate, major blue state, wall state, in fact, one of their blue wall states, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. They didn't. they doubled down with Walz. Having already discussed Tim Walz in an earlier view, I'll now turn my attention to Kamala Harris, specifically on policy issues. And she has spent, by the way, most of her time since being nominated hiding from the press and only doing one interview with CNN, with her support dog in tow, Tim Walz, and it was a disaster, unless you're into incomprehensible word salads. Just how far left is Kamala Harris? Let me tell you. After she cast a tie-breaking vote in favor of the multi-trillion-dollar cash infusion into an already overheated economy back in 2021, over the objection of renowned liberal Harvard economist Larry Summers, who had been Democratic President Barack Obama's Secretary of the Treasury, Harris's plan to deal with the aftershocks of record inflation she helped bring about for the economy is higher taxes to fund more discretionary spending for entitlement programs and unbelievably taxing unrealized capital gains. And to combat the high inflation this will cause, she's going to establish price controls to keep grocery prices in check, which almost all economists agree will do the exact opposite and cause greater inflation and food shortages. Now we will turn our attention to the southern border. Kamala Harris has said countless times she supports an open border. And as borders are, she clearly did. She has welcomed and presided over the greatest invasion of illegal immigrants our country has ever seen. Next on the progressive wish list, she supports radical gender ideology and supports trans biological males competing against young girls and women in sports, including full access to girls' locker rooms. You should read how the Biden-Harris administration has rewritten Title IX. Thankfully, the federal courts have already struck down some of their ridiculously far-left rhetoric because it's unconstitutional. It's a denial of equal protection for young girls and young women. Also, remember that her running mate, Tim Walz, has biological females who identify as boys covered in his administration in Minnesota by placing tampons in the boys' bathrooms in Minnesota public schools. This is social engineering at its craziest. Now we'll turn our attention to Kamala Harris's record on crime. She fully supports a George Soros-endorsed approach to law enforcement, including not prosecuting most retail theft, supporting the devastation caused after the death of George Floyd in the riots that broke out across this country. And when Kamala Harris was the district attorney or prosecutor of San Francisco, she shielded illegal immigrants from deportation even after they committed violent crimes. In one case, a drug-dealing illegal immigrant who had been arrested, she put into a jobs program, a job he couldn't legally hold. So what did she do? She cleared his criminal record. This miscreant would go on then to assault and almost kill a woman. In another case when she was DA, Kamala Harris released an illegal immigrant who had been arrested for unlicensed driving. He would go on to continue his illegal driving, except this time he struck Drew Rosenberg with his car and ran him over 3 times, killing him. That should cover her stance on law enforcement and crime. Now let's turn our attention to the fact that she adamantly, on the record, has voiced her opposition to all fossil fuel and fracking, although she now claims to be in favor of those things. These policies led directly to a 50% increase in gas prices, and many middle-class working families have to make hard choices of heat or eat in the winter in America. This November, we are going to get a clear answer on what type of country we are going to be. To me, I remember 2019 very well, and the type of America I was living in then. That seems like a long time ago.